we are going to be taken on board a ship which will take us to Cyprus. When we finally sighted that ship in the port of Haifa, it was the greatest feeling of letdown, a feeling of trauma and of uncertainty and to some extent of fear. For many of us came out of concentration camps. The ship already looked like a concentration camp because the decks were all wired in, caged in. And those of us who were still ashore and watched the others walk into these cages, these were moments of dread and difficulty for us.
While over 50,000 Jews were interned in camps in Cyprus, Jewish negotiations with the British led nowhere. International pressure mounted for Britain to change its policy, but to no avail. In Palestine, the Jews now fought the British by all available means. In 1946, the King David Hotel, British headquarters in Jerusalem, was bombed. Throughout the land, bridges were blown up. Soldiers were attacked. The continuing British response was imprisonments, armed searches, harsh penalties. An apparatus of repression and control was clamped down. Unable to find a solution, in February 1947, the British government requested the United Nations to intervene. After months of inquiry and debate, the United Nations General Assembly voted whether to partition Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab.
Yes. Soviet Union? Yes. United Kingdom? Abstain. The United States? Yes.
Approval of the new plan came from countries both east and west.
The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
There were to be two states occupying the area of Palestine, with Jerusalem an international city. Once more, 19 centuries after the destruction of Judea by Roman legions, the Jews were to have a land of their own. On May 14th, 1948, ending an occupation of 30 years and refusing to implement the United Nations partition plan, the British withdrew from Palestine. That afternoon in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion, leader of the National Jewish Council, proclaimed the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine to be called Israel. It was exactly 3 years, almost to the day, since the end of the war in Europe and the overthrow of the greatest tyranny that had ever oppressed the Jewish people. For the Jews, it was a miraculous transition from the deepest valley of despair to the fulfillment of their highest hopes. But the Arabs viewed the UN decision as a defeat. Arab irregulars from Syria and Lebanon, the armies of Egypt and Transjordan and other Arab forces crossed Palestine's border in arms, rushing to occupy the vacuum created by the British withdrawal. The Jews now had to take up arms to defend their lives, along with the life of their new state. With few weapons or supplies, but with determination and discipline, they created a civilian army. War raged the length and breadth of the land. Nowhere more fiercely than in besieged Jerusalem. It took a year of intense and hard-fought conflicts. The United Nations plan was destroyed in the flow of battle. Access to the old city of Jerusalem was lost. The city was split, its holiest places in the hands of Arab forces. By 1949, Israel emerged victorious, but at great cost, 6,000 dead, 1% of the Jewish population. For the first time in almost 2,000 years, there was a Jewish state. And in May 1949, Israel took her place as a member of the United Nations.
By some miracle, it had been successful. The Jews had been landless, united by the ties of their common history, their shared faith, and the ever-recurring cycles of their religious calendar. But now a great community had been created in the place which had dominated Jewish history. These Jews were bound together, not just in time, but also in the space of this new state. And the ancient prayer, "Next year in Jerusalem," took on a new meaning, a new significance.
For Jerusalem was now within reach. There was a welcoming door, a place of their own, a state whose fundamental law gave every Jew in the world the right to enter. And they came. More than 500,000 in the first 3 years alone. By 1951, the Jewish population of Israel had doubled to more than 1 million. They came from 42 countries, many, like these Yemenites, from the Arab lands. For the Yemenites, it seemed a biblical promise fulfilled, to be returned to Israel on the wings of an eagle, though the eagle turned out to be a battered DC-6. Plane after plane laboriously brought out the entire Jewish community of Yemen. 120,000 more were flown in from Iraq. For centuries, many Jews had lived scattered throughout Arab lands, their customs and culture very different from that of their European brethren. But in Israel, all these Jews were to share a common destiny and a common purpose. From Morocco, Jews brought the celebration of Mamuna, a festival unique to that community, marking the end of Passover. The variety of customs that had developed among the Jews during their 2,000 years of dispersion was now brought together for the first time within the borders of a single land. For most of those who came, Israel meant more than a refuge. They hoped to find in it a place of rebirth for the Jewish people, the site of a new Jewish culture. It was the deepest conviction of David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, that his people would create a new and vital culture as they worked to transform the land. He made a point of working on the land himself, demonstrating by his labor his belief in a society without privilege. He wrote,
"One could hardly find a revolution that goes deeper than what Zionism wants to do to the life of the Hebrew people. It is to be a homeland for every Jew who returns there, a homeland that provides equally for all her children."
Ben-Gurion and his wife lie buried here, at the edge of the desert which was at the heart of his vision, near the kibbutz Sde Boker, his last home. Inspired by the Zionist dream, Israelis took a neglected countryside and remade it. The kibbutz, a new kind of collective settlement, was one engine of this progress. A small number of Jews left behind their professions and their experiences of urban life to join in the kibbutzim and other pioneering villages to follow a new ideal, while working the land to participate equally in decisions made for the good of the community and the country as a whole.
We're going to a new place. We're going to build not just a settlement, not just a village, but a new way of life. Something different, something better. A place based on equality, on mutual help. Another society.
But the challenge that brought me to Israel was the very, very simple challenge. The new country, the Jewish country. The idea of building something from nothing. The togetherness of the kibbutz appealed to me. The hardship of the kibbutz appealed to me. I always likened what we did then to the opening up of the West in the United States.
The kibbutz, with its all-embracing social concerns, was for years a principal source of leaders for Israeli society. It was a concrete symbol of the Zionist dream. But the reality of life in Israel was often difficult. The country itself was beset by enemies on all sides, Arab states that resented its existence and vowed its destruction. Sometimes Israel feared it might be engulfed and destroyed. In 1967, that destruction seemed all too imminent. In May of that year, Egypt demanded that UN forces be withdrawn from Sinai. It moved to cut off the Israeli port of Eilat and massed 1,000 tanks and 100,000 troops in Sinai. For 2 weeks, Israel sought international assistance, but in vain. Uncertainty and tension gripped the nation. In Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and throughout the country, preparations were made for what seemed to be the inevitable conflict. When it came, Israel's response to Arab threats was swift and unexpectedly devastating. In less than a week, Israel was victorious. The Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, the West Bank of Jordan, under Israeli control. On June the 7th, Israeli soldiers took possession of the old city of Jerusalem, to which they had been denied access for 19 years. Now Jews were again able to reach the Western Wall, the ancient temple site, to pray before the deeply moving symbol of their origins as a people. Around the world, Jews were intensely proud of Israel's victory. For most communities, the effect was profound. This was particularly true among the 2 million Jews of the Soviet Union. One who remembers that moment vividly is Alla Rosinek, who was a high school student in Moscow at the time.
It was for the first time that the word Jewish had some positive connection. And after that, it didn't take me long to learn that there is a Jewish people that live in a Jewish state, that they have a Jewish history and religion and the language. And it is not that I don't belong anywhere. I do belong. I have a people and I have a country.
For the Jews of Russia in 1967, the celebration of Israel's victory was tentative, restrained by their own problems with the Soviet authorities. 50 years under Soviet rule had taken them on a journey between hope and despair. Red Square Moscow in the 1930s. The Communist Revolution had brought an end to Tsarist pogroms and persecutions of the Jews. The Jews had become prominent in Soviet life, in politics, science, and in the arts. The Soviets also encouraged all the cultures of their multinational state, including a secular Yiddish culture. Shlomo Michoels was lionized as the director of the Moscow Yiddish Theatre in the 30s, where many classics of the Yiddish stage were presented as authentic expressions of proletarian culture. Yiddish literature of all kinds flourished. 150,000 Jewish children studied in Yiddish at state-sponsored schools. In the course of the 1930s, however, Joseph Stalin turned his government into a system of absolute rule. Though the purges began almost immediately, it was not until after World War II that Stalin, fearful of disloyalty on all sides, selected the Jews as a major target of his paranoia. Dozens of Jewish leaders and intellectuals were murdered, including Michoels, all on fabricated charges. Gradually, the Soviet Union was crushing the identity of its Jews. By the 1960s, much of the physical witness of Jewish life had been destroyed as well. These images, filmed by Nodar Gingishvili, document the sense of Soviet Jewish life in those years.
It was becoming harder and harder to practice or feel as a Jew, and everything to do with the past and tradition was vanishing. I knew if I didn't record the scene now, it would soon be too late. It would all be gone. In Berdichev, the synagogue had become a stocking factory. In Kiev, a movie house. In Novorossiysk, it was a sewing shop. In Tbilisi, a clubhouse. In Lithuania, an office building.
Official hostility to Jewish identity had become a part of government policy. Within the empire, Jews were one of the few peoples whose culture the Soviets sought to repress. In the 1970s, as Jewish awareness grew, unofficial quotas excluded Jews from many posts in government, in the army, in medical and scientific institutes. University admission was restricted. By the early 80s, it was risky to openly celebrate the Jewish festivals. Jewish education was effectively forbidden, as were most expressions of Jewish culture. Those who fought this policy and caught the eyes of the world came to be called refuseniks.
In '83, my real trouble started. I was persecuted as a Hebrew teacher. They would break into my lessons, try to detain the students, try to confiscate the Hebrew books. And in '84, by the way, it was a very difficult period for all the Hebrew teachers and all the refuseniks, because if you remember, all the rulers of the then Soviet Union would die one after another, and those who were really in control were the KGB.
Yuli Edelstein was arrested in 1983 on trumped-up charges and sent to Siberia for 3 years.
1, 2, 3, 4, open up the iron door. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Dozens of other Jews were sent to jail for seeking exit visas to Israel, eliciting a massive world campaign for their freedom.
I think that the whole public campaign for the Soviet Jewry all over the world had a lot of effect on the government of the Soviet Union. Though they would always deny it, but we felt it very well.
Finally, after mounting international pressures in the 80s and the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union relaxed its policy toward the Jews. Some chose to reassert their Jewish identity through study and worship in the land of their birth. Others chose to emigrate to any country that would welcome them. It was not an easy departure. The future that beckoned lay in an unfamiliar world, far away from one's loved ones. In an astounding exodus that took less than a decade, more than 500,000 Jews, including Yuli Edelstein, emigrated to Israel. If departure had been hard, the arrival was no less difficult. There were new norms, new practices, a new language, and a new culture. The arrival of so many immigrants in so small a country had an enormous impact.
The real cultural and social influence of this wave of immigration is still part of the future, meaning that the very question of how we manage to integrate the new immigrants, bring them to the common denominator of the Israeli society, will more or less define their influence in the coming years.
The massive exodus of Russian Jews continued a movement begun more than 100 years earlier, which shifted the Jewish population of the world more and more toward two main centers, Israel and the United States. For the thousands of Jews who settled these streets and tenements of the Lower East Side of New York in the late 19th century, America was a haven and refuge from persecution. From Europe, the Jews brought with them a rich mix of responses to the modern world. While many became at home in the streets and neighborhoods of this country, they continued to feel part of the extended Jewish community. But the ambition that moved them all was to become Americans. Like other immigrant groups, they suffered from prejudices. Occasionally, they experienced anti-Semitism. But the troubles seemed to diminish with time. By the 1950s, Jews had joined in all walks of American life. In every way, they gave them.
We are going to be taken on board a ship which will take us to Cyprus. When we finally sighted that ship in the port of Haifa, it was the greatest feeling of letdown, a feeling of trauma and of uncertainty and to some extent of fear. For many of us came out of concentration camps. The ship already looked like a concentration camp because the decks were all wired in, caged in. And those of us who were still ashore and watched the other.
The United States, yes.
Approval of the new plan came from countries both east and west.
The resolution of the DAC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
There were to be two states occupying the area of Palestine, with Jerusalem an international city. Once more, 19 centuries after the destruction of Judea, the continuing British response was imprisonments, armed searches, harsh penalties. An apparatus of repression and control was clamped down. Unable to find a solution, in February 1947, the British government requested the United Nations to intervene. After months of inquiry and debate, the United Nations General Assembly voted whether to partition Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab.
Yes. Soviet Union? Yes. United Kingdom? Abstain.
Here by Roman legions, the Jews were to have a land of their own. On May 14th, 1948, ending an occupation of 30 years and refusing to implement the United Nations partition plan, the British withdrew from Palestine. That afternoon in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion, leader of the National Jewish Council, proclaimed the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine to be called Israel.
Let's walk into these cages. These were moments of dread and difficulty for us.
While over 50,000 Jews were interned in camps in Cyprus, Jewish negotiations with the British led nowhere. International pressure mounted for Britain to change its policy, but to no avail. In Palestine, the Jews now fought the British by all available means. In 1946, the King David Hotel, British headquarters in Jerusalem, was bombed. Throughout the land, bridges were blown up, soldiers were attacked,